Hello, everyone. I'm Nikki Alici. I'm the events coordinator at Ellevate Network, and I'm your host for today. Thank you for joining us for our closing session of Mobilize Women Week, Creating a Racially Reconciled Future. So if you're new to Ellevate, we are a coalition of ambitious, supportive women and allies who show up for each other and mobilize to change the culture of business. And as you've probably heard by now, Mobilize Women is about expanding our awareness and empathy and taking action towards a more equitable world. So we've covered a lot of topics this week, and we hope that you had at least one aha moment and will take what you've learned into your day-to-day. And as a special thank you for joining us at Mobilize Women Week, we are opening squad applications early just for you. So Ellevate squads will ensure you set aside 30 minutes each week for you to really dig deep into ideas, different perspectives, and next steps to tackle whatever hurdle you're facing, and meet with the same people for 12 weeks and really get to know each other. You'll get the accountability that can help you go further in your careers. So go ahead and pop in the chat the squads link for you to join as well. So this past year has shed light on the many flaws within our society, and it's shown how broken our healthcare and economic and justice systems truly are. So today, as we prepare to discuss how to dismantle systemic racism, we'd like to begin with a moment of silence. Join us in acknowledging the many lives lost this past year due to COVID-19, and especially those from communities of color who have been historically underserved. Let's also use this moment of silence to honor Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, Daunte Wright, Adam Toledo, Sooncha Kim, Soon Chung Park, and many, many others who have lost their lives because of the flaws in our system and the racism that is rooted in the fabric of our nation. Thank you. And thank you for joining us in the fight against hate, racism, and injustice. So during today's session, we'll be joined by the incredible speakers, and there will be time for them to answer your questions at the end. But a few housekeeping tips before. Please use the chat to engage with each other and our speakers. Quote cool things you hear to amplify the message, drop helpful links to life-changing books, websites, apps. We're all one big community showing up, so let's get connecting. Also post your questions in the Q&A box for the moderator to see, and click the CC closed captions icon to toggle them on. If need be, you can privately message the Ellevate team, who are identifiable as the host and co-host of the session and have Ellevate in our names. We are recording this session, and the recording will be posted to the Ellevate site for our members to view as an evergreen resource. And also share your experience on social media using pics or key takeaways, and use the hashtag #MobilizeWomen to share what you're learning. We're big, we're global, and we're always in this together. So thank you for tuning in. And now please welcome our moderator, Katrina Jones.
Oh, hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our closeout panel of the day, Creating a Racially Reconciled Future. I'm so excited to be here with you all, and I invite the panelists to also come on screen now. All right. And I'm just going to dive right in so we can have a really full conversation today. Before I do that, just want to take a moment to quickly share my pronouns. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I see the other panelists. If you'd also like to just share your pronouns as well, I think that would be wonderful.
Beautiful. I'm Kristen Marston. My pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon for some of you. My name is Manju Kulkarni, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
And Dakota?
Hi, it's actually Tokata, and my pronouns are she, they. Yeah.
Thank you, Tokata. And welcome again, everyone. I'm just going to jump right in. Today we're here talking about how we can create a racially reconciled future. How do we do that in community with each other? How do we pull allies into this work? And so that's the place I want to start in talking about allyship, especially after a year on, when everybody has read every book about, being anti-racist and what that means, and we've had multiple movements. When you think about allyship and how we can engage people around allyship, what does that look like? And this is open to anyone who wants to jump in.
Well, I can start. For me, allyship really is about, that solidarity, being there for each other, both publicly, but also privately. And part of that for me, coming from the Asian American Pacific Islander community, is understanding our history. I think, part of what we're hearing today is these, a controversy around critical race theory. But what it is really is about truth and understanding facts, right? And understanding history. And too often people don't know that. And I can speak for my community a little bit to say that, we were not told our history growing up in school. There may have been a little bit about the Chinese Exclusion Act or the Japanese American internment, but there's so much more in terms of both some of the challenges that our communities had that we don't understand because of the model minority myth, which lumps us all together and also pits us against other communities of color. And, one way I want to express that or understand that solidarity is the fact that many of us wouldn't even be here without the African American leaders of the civil rights movement. And I say that because after the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were passed and signed by President Johnson, they didn't stop there. They said, you know what, our immigration laws are racist too. And people outside of Europe are not allowed to come into the United States. And they were right. And so because they fought for opening that up, families like mine could come to the United States in the early 70s and 80s. So I wanted to say, for me, it's about paying it forward, being there at the Black Lives Matter marches and rallies, showing my support for Latinx communities, indigenous communities in their struggles every day. So that's what I think allyship is knowing that history and then being able to take action moving forward on it.
Yeah, thank you, Manju. I appreciate your call out too of that solidarity. Kristen? Uh-huh.
I think that was beautifully said. And I think, I would just add that to me, it's also about, making space and listening and learning, right? Like none of us have all the answers. And I think it's, having a commitment to continuously growing and learning and being able to educate ourselves on things that, unfortunately are not taught in our educational system growing up, about the realities of what various communities are living in this country. And so making a commitment to, continue to educate ourselves, make space for those who, really want to share their experiences and really be willing to hear them and acknowledge them. And then, being willing to take action and support those who are trying to make change and who are advocating on behalf of their communities. And so, getting to the place where you're comfortable speaking up, but also letting go of a lot of the things that we've been taught that are okay in this country. And that takes a lot of discomfort to say, like I was taught that, it's okay to, go watch this sports team that is like disparaging to Native American communities, right? Like this is the sports team I grew up with. Those things take addressing your discomfort, right? And letting go these things that we are taught to be comforting to ourselves, but actually are really harmful to other communities. And so, I think, digging deep and being committed to that lifelong process of ridding ourselves of all the things that we've been taught.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add is just I'm sort of thinking about what allyship is, right? Like, if I can make the sort of assumption that these problems are all symptoms of a root cause, you know what I mean? If I can acknowledge that the systems are the same and that they affect people differently, but that we're also all still struggling with the same disease, you know what I mean? And so then I think that allyship is maybe the recognition within an individual, right, that they are affected, like the recognition within an individual that they are hurt, that there is healing to be done, that there is work to be done. Because I think that that is the very first step, which not very many people take. You know, they see issues, they see movements, and they feel separate from them. Which is crazy because we all live on the same globe. Yeah, no, I think that it really is like a personal responsibility. Allyship, like, is really crazy if you're looking at it from a perspective of you are separate from other people, right? But if we're looking at it as if we are the same, if we can accept that no matter who anyone is, beyond their political beliefs, beyond, you know, their identities in any fashion, but just on the basis that they are human and that they are living under the same institutions that we are, we can know that they are also hurting. Yeah, and then that's where I guess allyship comes together, right? Because in that hurt is where people learn to come to each other for healing.
Yeah. Praketa, thank you for that. I want to tease out something you said, because you said root cause. And it's so important that we acknowledge that common root cause, right? Because if I think it's something different and you think it's something different.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would say colonialism. And then I would also say that that is completely inextricably intertwined with capitalism. I would say that it's the same thing. But yeah, for me, that it feels like the root cause. And I do believe that it might be it for most of the world.
Yeah, finding that common ground, that common language, understanding that inextricable ties between colonialism, capitalism, and also white supremacy. When we think of these root causes, and I hear everyone talking about, you know, staying in it with folks. How do we stay in it, and how do allies stay in it, and not prioritize their comfort? Because that comes up a lot, right? Of the work is hard, it's emotional, there's all these complex feelings that come up, and it's really easy to find yourself in that space of defensiveness and prioritizing your comfort, right? But how do you stay in it with people and not center your comfort and yourself?
You know, one thing I'll say to that is, you know, the title of today's conversation is about a racially reconciled future. But to reconcile, I think you first have to have a reckoning. And that's something that we haven't actually had in this country, both nationally, historically, as well as between communities, right? So I think that we need to have that reckoning first. So we're in agreement on, you know, that starting point. You know, what's our foundational understanding of what our country's experienced? What's our understanding of, you know, I spoke about being pitted against other communities of color, and that's part of how white supremacy works. And for us in the Asian American community, it's been very explicit by creating a term called the model minority. This professor from Berkeley, Professor Peterson, in 1966, at the height of the civil rights movement, said, Asian Americans are a model because they didn't demand civil rights, and African Americans were a problem minority because they did, right? And so right there, you understand how things are framed, one against the other. And that continues through this day, right? And we're all functioning against, in that white supremacist world where we're fighting over crumbs. And I'll tell you that my organization, APCON, after the uprising in LA in the 1990s, we had to have some of those hard conversations because there were Korean American business owners, you know, who owned convenience stores and other things that were looted, or, you know, that experienced burning. And, you know, there were African American communities that were suffering under, you know, poverty and white supremacist conditions in LA. So we had to come together and talk it out, you know, fight it out sometimes, but then also understand what were we under, which is that during the uprising, the police sat on their hands. They didn't do anything to help either community out. And that's what led to the destruction. So I think definitely, Katrina, you've hit on a really important point, which is we've got to have those hard conversations before we can come to agreement.
Yeah. Kristen, you looked like you had something you were reflecting on and wanted to say here.
Yeah, I think, I think I would just add that, to what I already kind of alluded to is that, and that you all have alluded to, is that, systemic racism is so embedded into the fabric of every single part of this country and world, right? And so to have the courage to become conscious of something that you haven't necessarily had to be conscious of your whole life based on whatever community that you're from takes work, right? And like, not everybody wants to do that work. And I think that that's why we get like performative allyship, right? Like it feels good to say, like, right, it feels good to do the surface stuff and to say like, oh yeah, like let me put a Band-Aid on it. But it takes real work to actually, go in and like heal the wound, right? And so like how do we move away from like these like like performative feelings and actually do the work, and doing the work takes a lot of discomfort, and putting yourself in positions where you're not always going to be centered. And I think real solidarity in action includes like concrete work, to be become knowledgeable about the issues that that are affecting people. And it goes beyond like putting Black squares on Instagram and all the things that we've had conversations about for the last year. It goes beyond, right? Like what we like to say is, it's kind of like, okay, so we're sending water to Flint, but we're not fixing the pipes, right?
Yeah.
So how do we, and obviously there's a real need there, for communities that's very urgent, but how do we actually go to the root of the issue and tackle the systems and structures? And that's where I think it takes real courage to dive in and take a stand for the change that needs to occur to support all of our communities.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Can we're talking about, and you mentioned performative allyship, which is something we really need to hold up and to pick at, right? Like we need to inspect it and call it out for what it is. And from all of the spaces and places that you all sit, what has performative allyship look like? And what would real allyship, I'm laughing at your face. What would real allyship look like? Like real solidarity? What would that look like? I think it's important for folks to understand the contrast and comparison between the two.
I can jump in. I mean, for example, we work with a lot of companies behind the scenes to try to change their standards and practices from within. We launched an initiative called Change Hollywood in response to the uprisings. And so we're asking, studios, production companies, agencies, et cetera, across the board to really commit to reviewing their past practices. And, something that I've really seen is a lot of people who have outreached, right? Because they say they want to do better and it feels good. And, you know, like their first step is saying like, I want to hire more Black people, right?
Yeah.
But, and then they leave it at that, right? So to them, that feels good. And to me, that's very like performative. It's like, hey, I'm reaching out because, you know, I saw it happen with George Floyd. I would love, do you know any Black people, right? So instead of doing the work, like getting to know other communities, you're reaching out to other Black people to do the work, to help you to find people to hire. And then you are also not actually hiring them. And then if you are hiring them, what we're seeing, like we did a race in the writers' room study a few years back, for example, that like Black writers would get into writers' rooms and they would be hired, but then they would have to repeat the same like lower level role way more times than like their white counterparts. And then like also were subject to a lot of mistreatment. So it's like performative allyship to me is like, oh, I'm going to hire a Black person, but I'm not actually going to treat them well. And so I think, you know, that's where I'm seeing a lot of the change still needing to happen. It's like, it's great that you're like putting out these statements, but what have you done beyond these statements? And how are you reinvesting into Black communities? How are you investing in Black careers? How are you supporting your Black talent?
Yeah, that's real. The outsourcing, so leaning on other folks to phone their Black friends so that you can now say you have a Black friend, and then not doing anything within the space that you're in, the space that you might have power in to change the environment, to make sure that the Black folks that you're bringing in will have the support that they need to actually thrive in this work and in that space. Manju, Taketa, I'd love to hear from you, like what performative allyship looks like from the spaces you're in, what real allyship looks like. What is it? How is it that you want people to show up as allies?
Well, I agree with what Kristen said in terms of, you know, going on social media and posting different things. I mean, that's easy, right? Any one of us can do that in a few seconds or minutes. But for me, it's really about interrogating power and reconsidering, you know, our policies. So when I say interrogating power, it's like, who has that power? How does it get wielded? And acknowledging our own power, right? You know, right now, one of the issues we're working on is around redistricting. And so thinking about, you know, right now we're in a scary place in terms of a number of states are looking at nullifying elections. Basically, legislatures are saying, you know what, we don't necessarily care what the vote is. If we don't like it, we're going to pick the president ourselves, right? Not being able to come to terms with, you know, the fact that, you know, one party lost and one party won in the presidential election, and there was actually an insurrection, right? So thinking about what all that means and what are then the ways in which we fight voter suppression, we fight gerrymandering. And in Los Angeles, I can tell you, you know, we are part of something called the People's Bloc, where people of color are coming together and saying, you know what, we're not going to fight over the crumbs so that it's like, oh, can I have some Asian American Pacific Islander districts and you get some Latinx districts and you over here get African American and you get indigenous districts. No, we're coming together and saying, you know what, we want more of the pie. And we're going to work together to make sure that we get more of the pie, because we represent more than 50% of the population, closer to 75%. But you wouldn't know that by who gets elected and the policies that get put forward. And so that's the other piece too, is being able to advocate for policies that don't just help your individual communities, but also other communities of color and marginalized communities. So I think that's some of the hard work that needs to be done.
Totally agreed. That is the solidarity. It is, our liberation is bound up together, right?
Exactly.
Taketa, for you, for performative allyship, talk to us about the squares that you're seeing.
Yeah. I think, I mean, honestly, performative allyship is like really actually super scary, and it's something that's definitely not talked about in our spaces like enough at all. And to name it and to look at the like patterns of behaviors that people have and are using to exploit movements and to exploit people is like super scary. um but yeah, I think one of the main things that I've come to learn is that you really have to look at um like not just like why people are doing something, right? Like people will tell you why they're doing something, but it's going to actually be in identifying where the benefits of said project that you're working on are going, right? Like, are they going to a TV network? Are they going to an individual? Are you getting paid as an activist? Like, it took so much to even learn that I should be getting paid at all for doing public speaking. Like, so I started when I was like 9, you know, so then all of the work that I was doing probably up until I was like 15 was unpaid, simply because I didn't know.
Yeah.
And so then like thinking about all of those people who wanted me to come and speak at their events, right? Who were just completely comfortable exploiting me. Like it really is a visceral thing, and it's an acknowledgement of our own behavior, and it's a checking of myself as well, like with the privileges that I have, and in the environment and the spaces that I'm allowed to be in, like what becomes my responsibility for my community back home. You know what I mean? Like I don't really see a lot of like the binaries. Like I feel like, you know, when I go into a room, very simply I represent people who look like me. Like because of the systems that we live in, like obviously that's fucked. No one should have to live like that. But when people of color walk into a room, they represent people that they look like. And it becomes like an obligation to try to interact with the world in a way that feels protective over myself and my own people. And when you need help, you are looking for anyone and everyone, you know, who is willing to give that. At least we were. Like at Standing Rock, for example, like that really sharply comes to mind, because there was this physical encampment, right? Like you can't say like this is performative. There are people there living there, right?
Yeah.
But also like, what about when those people left? What about the community that still has a pipeline beneath it, you know? The town that has probably a slightly lesser population than when anybody came. Like it is a really scary thing. And so in order to deal with it, right, it is entirely about intention. If you are doing something simply for your benefit, and when I say your benefit, I mean your institutions, I like it, for white folks specifically, right? When you come into a space, there are already privileges set up, and it has to be your responsibility to first acknowledge those so that we can try to create a level playing field for each other within each relationship. And it's going to be very specific, and it takes a lot of work because those things are complex, especially when it comes into money. Like, how do we properly compensate everyone? And what will that look like? You know, how do we put value on this sort of labor? How do we put value on what it means to exchange knowledges like this? Yeah, no, it's super, super complex, but it's also necessary to talk about because it's like the most colonizer thing you could do is to like say that you want to help and then inject yourself into spaces so that you can overtake them, like so that you can colonize them, you know, like
Yes.
that's backwards as hell.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
You've mentioned a really, I think, interesting paradigm and shift in this idea that activists and people who are champions of justice and fighting for their communities and for others are not necessarily supposed to exist in poverty, right? And complete suffering all the time. And I'm hearing that more from, I think, younger generations who are coming into it and saying, yes, and I am fighting and I deserve rest, right? Like I still deserve a measure of comfort and luxury, and you can have both, and it's not a binary. And for you, like you've been in this work for since you were 8, 9?
9.
9.
Yeah.
Like, what is it like to be in this from such a young age? And what do you think other young people need in terms of support to be, catalysts and to do this work?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a little different, right? Because I feel like it was completely embedded in me from the time that I was like very, very small, just sort of that we were in oppositional forces to the institutions and systems that were around us. It always felt very apparent to me that like there was me and then there was this like enemy, you know what I mean? And it also was very much apparent because I was Native American and I was growing up in North Dakota, which like was insane and completely racist and really hard to navigate. But I would, it's hard really to like, I can't speak about what other people need, but I can say that I needed, for example, one of my college professors to tell me that school was gonna suck for me. And it did. It does. It sucks for me because education as an institution sucks. like very blatantly, right? It's giving people the support for these out of pocket things that they're saying. And out of pocket, I just mean that nobody's making those analyses. You know what I mean? Like nobody's saying, oh yeah, actually it would be very contradictory of me as a Native person to attend your institution while they're unearthing graves of children at institutions in Canada. You know what I mean? Like, why would I want to participate? Like, people don't take the time to like acknowledge those coexisting realities. And for young people, giving kids simply the space to ask questions. One of the first things that ever like made me think, I'm different was recognizing that the houses that were built on reserves and reservations are all maybe like one of 3 colors and they're built entirely exactly the same. So there's just these clone houses all over the res. And then when you come into these border towns, all of a sudden there's like diverse architecture. And I remember thinking when I was young, why is there this difference here? Yeah, you really like, because it is an impossible situation that we find ourselves in, because it sounds almost comical that there was a race of people who decided that they were better than everyone else on a planet. You know what I mean? Like, you need to level with children and be honest with them about like how fucking bonkers that is. What, like, I don't understand why there aren't more people who are just willing to be like, listen, if this was possible, I know for a fact that revolution is too. You know what I mean? Like we act about it, we talk about it like change is something far-fetched and going to happen like, in the next generations, but like, what about the people who need it now?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. That is so powerful, right? We act as if the revolution is impossible. And when we look back historically, and Manju, you spoke about this, about how quickly change can happen, right? Even over the last, I don't know, few years. Actually, I was having a conversation with somebody about the celebration of Pride and Pride Month, and how now you go into a Target or a Walmart and like there is in our entire sections, right? There are t-shirts and banner like and balloon and everything you can think of. And it wasn't like that even like 5 years ago. So that change is really possible, and even to happen at a really radical pace. And we are seeing some of it now, even as slow as it feels. But we still need to ask ourselves, like, why not faster? Why not now? Who's being left out? And Minju, from all that you have seen, especially between Asian and Black communities, how have you seen change, occur across communities and with that?
Well, I think some of that has just been, I mean, you're absolutely right, Katrina, that within our own lifetimes, we are seeing this change. So it's not fast enough for us, but it's also happening, really, really fast, right? Incredibly fast, in terms of sort of, you think of humans on this planet and in just the last 25 years or 100 years, what we've been able to accomplish. And, so much of that can really be, I think, attributed to women and what we've been able to do and bring to the conversation that men never have, right? And I want to just point out right now, during the pandemic, the countries that did the best were the ones run by women. So you look at New Zealand, you look at Germany, they did better than, the United States, than, countries like Brazil and others, and India. So to me, what this is about is, really to Kata's point is like, that we need to think about how our structures support certain communities and not others. It is exhausting, right? And there's also the intergenerational trauma that we haven't even talked about, which is, it's the trauma we experience, but what about the ones, I mean, to see, it's horrible for me to read about how they've uncovered countless bodies in Canada. And, and I don't even come from the Indigenous community. I can't imagine what it's like, to read every day in the paper about, the horrific crimes that were committed against communities, against children. And so understanding that these struggles are there and the support networks are still not there for us. So we're trying to be activists, or a lot of us out there are just trying to do, take care of our families and, go to college, get a good job. And that's hard to do when all of this is happening alongside that and we don't get the support that we need.
That's right. And that support, I can't say this enough, right? That as an activist, as champions of justice, that we also deserve respite, rest, right? Comfort, luxury, whatever your luxury, whatever your luxury is, that this is part of the shifting in paradigm. So, Kristen, I want to ask you, as we're talking about things rapidly changing, I'm thinking about the work that you do in media and film, and just thinking about how rapidly representation has changed over the last few years. We still, of course, have a long way to go, but we've seen some recent successes over the last few years, as well as some real challenges within representation. Can you share more about, how representation fits into this picture and this conversation around a racially reconciled future, and why it matters?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Like, we're now at the place, for example, where Black people are overrepresented on TV in proportion to our population, but still the issues that affect our communities are still very misrepresented. And there's still a lot of trauma associated with our stories. And I can't tell you, how many scripts that I get from, white men who are writing about Black communities, which they've probably never been to. And the entire scripts are just based in trauma, right? Like where every single thing happens to the Black person. It's like their family dies and then they were trying to get out of their neighborhood on a sports scholarship, and then they accidentally kill a police officer, and then they're assaulted by like group, you know what I mean? And then it's just, and it's like, and that's like in the pilot, that's like in the first episode, like what is going to happen, moving forward. And so I think, it's good to have representation, right? Like we know that like there's communities that don't even have that, right? Like the Native community, like on TV, for example, is just like, like a whole nother thing, right? Like a whole problem in itself, right? So there's communities who are still fighting to even be seen and to be seen, accurately. And then when it comes to my work in advocating for the Black community, it's like there's still what we really want to highlight and what I work with people on, right? Like I'm not a replacement for Black writers, but what I want to do is I really want to help people highlight the systems and structures that play in this country that we've really talked about. And so, how do we get beyond, conversations about one bad cop, right? Because we know that like, that makes people say, oh, like, that sucks. Like, that's unfortunate that like that was one bad guy. That was one guy. But if we're not highlighting the conversations about the systems and structures and the TV shows and the media that we consume, people keep continuing saying, oh, that's one guy. That was one sociopath, but that's not reflective of the people that are heroes of our community versus them really getting educated through our storylines of the fact that like policing was started as like slave patrol, and and how that manifests in what we're seeing and what we've been very exposed to, having been stuck at home in the last year, but like really making people make the ties between the foundation that this system was built on and how it's at play. And so for me it's representation about systems and structures, as well, versus being seen, which is another conversation about representation as well.
There are so many things I want to tackle. I would love to tackle both about, connecting people to the lessons around systems, and doing that in such a way that where you're not re-traumatizing or traumatizing viewers. And I know we talked about this in our prep call about some of the recent shows and features that have been out that really have gone, I think, to an extreme extent in portraying, physical violence or brutality that's rooted in race-based violence. How do we pull back from that, right? Like, how do we get away from replaying those scenes over and that brutality over and over, and still have representation and still talk, and educate people about systems?
I mean, I think like, right, like I think it's incorporating more narratives. We're not like advocating for, we're advocating for the removal of like the most egregious narratives, right? Like shows like Cops, like those need to be gone and eradicated, right? But like we're advocating for just more well-rounded and nuanced depictions of our communities. And so it doesn't mean that we're perfect. It doesn't mean that there aren't stories about the history of what's happened to our communities in this country. People actually need education and to understand what has taken place. And so films like 13th, or like, to me that is traumatic to me to watch, but it's a beautiful outline of like, that's weird saying it in association with that, but like it tells a story that people need to know that we aren't taught coming up in this education system. So we need those stories, right? But then there's films that like, and like we talked about this a little bit, but like there's shows that like come out like Them, right, that I feel like are just like highly unnecessary, where, it's like, I feel like there's no nuance and there's no joy in the depictions of Black people. And I feel like, you know, yes, like you can talk about these things that have happened to us, and you can talk about the way that these things haunt our communities, which I think was kind of like supposed to be like this underlying metaphor of this show, right? But what happens when you remove any humanity is that people start to associate your community with having no humanity subconsciously. And I remember when I was doing consulting for like immigration narratives, more on like legal sides of like what does an ICE raid look like, all of those things. There was a study, and I wish I could remember who did it because it was really great, but they talked about how like if you associated, like even when you did depictions on TV of immigrants being feared or fearful, so either the immigrants are scared or they're feared by someone else, it does the same thing to viewers' minds. And so how do we not keep triggering that same thing in people's minds where our communities are only associated with fear? And to do that, we need more well-rounded narratives, and we need more opportunities to tell our own stories.
Amen to that. I am thinking, and Manju, I saw your mic go off just also about stories, period. One of the things, of course, that I'm connecting the dots on is it's easy to dehumanize people and to treat, for example, Indigenous children as less than, all right, when you don't see them, when all the depictions of Native and Indigenous people are as brutal as to be feared or just non-existent.
Well, and I think Christian's point is so important. As an immigrant myself and someone who's from a community of color, I mean, I'm not just a conglomeration of struggles and trauma. Like, I have joy in my life. I have, I like, ice cream. Like, it doesn't always have to be about things that we're suffering through. And I think too often we get into just these depictions of almost like trauma porn, which is that they're constantly, that's the characters are just one dimensional and they're about suffering, right? And then what happens sometimes, and this happens with female characters a lot, is that then you are almost deifying them by just talking about their struggles, and they need to be selfless and they need to be about activism or overcoming struggle, but there are a lot of parts of our being, right? And I think you talked about that earlier, Katrina, in terms of having that rest, the respite, being able to find joy in our lives. One thing that I'd love to have us think about is, how can we get beyond just narratives of like a single protagonist and talk about those, structures within these depictions, whether they're on TV or movies, because that's too often what it is, right? Is like you have that lone cop who's awful, but you also have the maverick who's out there fighting. And that's not how it actually works, right? It wasn't just Martin Luther King Jr., right? That's all we hear during Black History Month. There were thousands and thousands of people behind it, and yet somehow we don't allow ourselves that space to think about the structures and then the mass mobilization that happens to bring about change.
Yes, so many untold stories, right? And here is to joy, because yes, we like ice cream, right? I think if you can tolerate it, I think there are so few stories out there that we feel the pressure that every story has to be meaningful, right? Because as we're talking about cops, we've already teased out like these two different archetypes of a maverick and the good cop and the bad cop, because there are so many cop stories, right? We don't need any more cop stories. We need more stories. Keta.
Yeah, I mean, it's I've been thinking recently about like going into film, like taking film more seriously, because I've always done work with media in my life and in my activism or whatever. but um but yeah, no, it when I started like actually looking, for media that portrayed, that felt good to me, like it really happens very fast that you realize that there are not that many options to actually feel like there's an accurate portrayal of Indigenous identity that exists in any sort in anything mainstream. Like I don't know that I've seen that, um unless I would have to like look at like my own work that I made, you know what I mean? Like it's really hard. That stuff, all of the things that I've learned and that have been completely instrumental in building like who I am and understanding more about who I am, have been from conversations. They've not, I've not been able to have that thing where like you can Google a question about yourself and like have an answer. And it's
Yeah.
been a problem in school too, because like when I want to write from an Indigenous perspective and they want evidence-based practice, I can't offer that to them because my history isn't documented the way it should be. And it's really like been a struggle, and people don't understand like how deeply rooted like art, just as one thing, like changes entire cultures. And so the way that we are portrayed there, it matters like immensely. Like it matters like probably more than anything else, because of the amount of people watching these things, because of the just the sheer reach that we have, which is global. Standing Rock wouldn't have happened if there was not media happening there. And most like a lot of movements happening now. I mean, like think about the school strikes for climate, you know what I mean? Like that is a global movement, and that would not have happened if it was not for the media and for people being receptive to that. And so people have learned to be receptive to our trauma. Like how like crazy is that people have learned to be a certain extent of comfortable seeing this imagery. And especially like with with everything that happened like in the last year with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, like it is really intense to like look at the commodification of death. um and it is an intense thing, and you see it in all communities of color, is that people are okay receiving us when we are the little guy, when we are the weakling of a situation. They are okay supporting us when we are the underdog. But if we're ever going to take a position of like, no, we actually inherently have the authority to protect ourselves and our land, our space, our joy, you know what I mean? Like that's when things get weird, and they're like, well, if you get to do that, like why can't I? And it's like because you've been sitting there in your joy and comfortability for centuries and pretending like the rest of the world wasn't in pain, right? Like comfortable actually doesn't exist for anyone right now. It really shouldn't. You don't get to just be comfortable if, like, say I am a white man in a position of power, right? Like knowing my station and like acknowledging that I have more than other people, and recognizing and being very intentional about the fact that I have so much more, which very viscerally means that somebody else, probably entire communities of people, have less.
Yeah.
like there is no like questions about like that disparity.
Yeah. I hate to cut you off. So sorry. We're in this stream of consciousness and there are some questions. So I just want to make sure we have a chance. The questions are open to anyone. I'll just take one answer per panelist so we can get through as many as possible. I'll start with a question from Breanne. What would you say to someone with cisgender, with white cisgender male privilege who acknowledges systemic racism but is overwhelmed with the complexity of the problem that they focus on, quote unquote, protecting me and mine? How do you break through that empathy barrier? So anyone who wants to respond to that.
I'll just say really quickly, I mean, it is about having circles of empathy that are wider than yourself, your family. But you can start locally, right? You don't have to tackle every issue on the national stage. You know, if there is a question of resources for your school district or programs that your neighborhood can engage in. Right now, we have an initiative to get every city and county to condemn hate and racism, essentially discrimination. We're releasing that on Monday, and literally you could take that resolution, go to your city council and say, let's pass this. Let's agree that we want to condemn the hate that our city is experiencing, our county now. I think there's a lot that folks can do. I know it can get overwhelming, but take the first step is what I would say, and try to broaden that circle of empathy.
Awesome. Thank you. One more question, and I'll again get through as many as I can. This one's from Janet. Given what it takes, is people authentically looking within personally and then taking new actions? There's a lot of personal resistance to being willing to look within. What is one thing you think you can present to those that are not open that could move them into inquiry and change?
I mean, I just recently found out that not everyone asked this question, but literally like it sounds so simple, but everyone was born on the earth like in the same fashion. And then like you just have to ask, like, why did anyone have the right to interfere with my human existence? Like, very much so, like asking yourself who and what are shaping your reality, like, and why you don't get any agency or autonomy in like very much how you spend your time. And when you're a kid, you know that, so you ask all of those questions. It's why all of the time. And yeah, I don't, it's hard. Like,
Yeah.
I don't like, for me, right? Because I could feel that there was something inherently wrong. Like, then the question was why. But I would understand that, like, you know, if nothing was seemingly wrong and if it felt comfortable and I felt protected, you know, why would I ask those questions? And people, yeah, people really don't want to ask those questions at all, because it would have to mean dismantle. It would have to mean admitting that they're actually not like, okay, like,
Yeah.
because even if you have money, even if you have money, like, thinking about the fact that your entire basis of like success and happiness is now like tied to like how much money you have, and the security of your children is based off of how much money you have, and it's really like, no. Yeah, I would say ask that, and then ask about your own history. I think that there's, all of our movements intersect at some points, and it is about looking to the sort of radicals. I mean, for me at least, it's about looking in my own history for the radical people who were already doing the work. Because I know that they exist. I know that if I'm asking these questions, somebody else has already asked them. I know that if I'm having an idea, somebody else has already had this idea, and there are people out there who want to work with me. And it's like the thing that you were talking about, Manju, with like the narrative of this hero, right? Like, which is so crazy because communities are necessary and essential to actually fix any of those problems. Like Superman actually doesn't exist, and it's not going to be a sole white man that comes in and like saves us. You know what I mean? It's going to be actually probably entirely like groups of women of color. And if we know that, then we need to start looking for how we can allocate resources and our time and energy into those spaces. And it's being very precious about that. We get to be picky. We get to be picky because people, I get to be picky. I get to be picky because there are people in my lineage who had zero choice.
Yes.
You know?
I want to ask if I can squeeze in two more questions. One, I'll start with the first one. How can we best support and not exhaust those people whom we are trying to support? Allies. So how can allies best support and not exhaust the people who are doing the work whom they're trying to support?
I think it's almost like you have to be willing to think about things that you haven't thought about before, and that takes energy. And I think I like talked about this a little bit before, but like after the uprisings, you know, we got like an influx of outreach, right? And it was people who were like, oh, we want to do the right thing for Black people. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. And suddenly like everybody was so motivated. And, you know, like a lot of those calls went something like, hey, like we decided we wanted to do a nationwide tour to like do concerts in support of Black people. So all we need from you is to commit 15 hours a week. This was a real conversation, to our committee, right? And so like I've had to have so many conversations about like, this is not a time where like in certain people's minds, advocating for Black and brown communities is calling them up and asking them to do the work so that they can feel good that the work was done. And so now more Black people are being asked to do unpaid work because we want to hear from you. Like we want to know everything, right? Like we want to know. So like, I think, you know, being cognizant of that, like there are certain things that you can do yourself, right? And you've just never like you as in whoever, but like have just never had to do it, right? So like so many people call me and we talked about this a little before, but they're like, hey, like I need some like Black writers and creators, right? Which
Yeah.
means I've essentially been doing, and I make the connections at a lot of times because I want Black people to get hired, right? But there's not that thought about the position that it puts the person that they're asking in, because then I'm essentially doing unpaid producer work and I'm staffing your project for you, right? And like producers get paid well to do that, right? And so then we're doing extra work on top of our positions to help you, when in fact you're actually in part of a union that I don't even have access to, and you could just call your own union, right? Like the resources are right there, you're just not using them, right? And so I think like being cognizant of those things, because it feels like you're doing something good, but you're actually like exhausting and using people.
Yeah, that is a understanding your power of privilege, right? You have gone and hired the Black writers, and you did nothing to expand your network or to make sure that those Black writers have access to the union that you've been a member of for decades, right? May hold a position of authority, and that's the work, right? Not leaning on other people. That is the real work. Manju, there's a question in the chat that is so good. I want to make sure we squeeze this in if possible. And the question is, as an immigrant slash or family of immigrants, how do you approach bridging the gap of race and racial relations in your community as it relates to the US culture and unifying all of us, as opposed to the competitiveness between cultures and races and stigmas that we've been taught about each other.
Well, part of it for me, and I want to just acknowledge in the chat, there's been so much robust discussion and resources and books. And, one that stands out for me is an article that Toni Morrison wrote about immigrants. It was actually in the 1990s, but she said basically that immigrants come to the United States and they immediately understand the racial hierarchy. They understand that whites are on top and people of color are on the bottom. And so who do they want to align with? They want to align with who's on top, right? And so for especially Asian American communities, there's something that we experience, which is white adjacency, right? Living in the suburbs, going to, good public schools, like having some of those resources that a lot of communities of color have really been refused. And so understanding that dynamic, I think early on, I was really, I would say, blessed with parents who, like, despite their socioeconomic privilege and educational privilege, saw that, right? And saw that there were these connections and said, you know what, we are the same as our African American and Latinx sisters and brothers. And so that, like, for me, from the very beginning, a lot of my fellow, like friends, classmates who are also South Asian or Asian American didn't see that, because their parents probably told them the opposite, which is, oh, we're like white folks and these other folks are different and beneath us, right? And so I think, to the other question too is, the reason this is so hard is because people have power and they have money tied to it, right? So they don't want to give it up. And so in order for us to give it up is we need to learn our history. We need to have the resources, so we're not just doing this unpaid. But keep in mind, when you dismantle power, it's not going to be easy. I will take a scene and just want to end with this for my answer. There's a scene in the movie Gandhi from South Africa early on, before he even started with Indian independence, where there were lines of people and the British literally, like, would beat with sticks one line. And it was, back then it was only men, and the women would carry them off. And then it was the next row in line and they would beat them. And then the next row, because the thing is, it is going to take all of us. It's going to take every one of us to dismantle that power. It's not going to be one or two people. We've got to get out of our comfort in some ways. We don't have to do it all the time. We can still enjoy naps. We can still enjoy ice cream. We can go to a movie, but it is going to take us all being able to deal with that discomfort and fight it to make those changes.
Yeah, thank you. Our wonderful folks from Ellevate have given me the last question. So I'll ask one last question, Nikki, if I still can, or no?
Oh, we have time for one last question.
All right. This is for all of the panelists. We'll just ask you to keep it brief, Manju, and I want to thank you for that, especially for referencing the Toni Morrison article. It's a really good memory about the racial hierarchy and what we quickly learn to and assimilate to. The last question for you all: what does a racially just future look like? I'll start with Manju.
I think at the most basic level, it's where we get self-actualization. We get to be our entire authentic selves and have opportunities that everyone else gets, right? So that we get the resources to pursue higher ed if that's what we want. We get the resources for clean water, for goodness sakes, right? Like, there's just I mean, at this point, we're simply fighting for necessities, but if we can bring resources to bear so that, because I actually don't believe that it's, a zero-sum game. We do live in abundance. Mother Earth, honestly, has given us so much. And if we share it, and we play well in the sandbox, frankly, we can all have that, and we can all live the lives that we want. And that's, to me, what a racially just future looks like. But it's going to take a lot of work to get there.
Yes, together. Thank you. Kristen, and then Taketa, excuse me.
What keeps coming to mind to me is just freedom, being free to operate without the constraints that, what is that even like? What is it like to, not have to worry about, these things that we have to carry every day, right? Like, is my name going to deter someone from hiring me? Or if, I don't take this certain job, am I going to be deemed less worthy by society if I'm not in a higher status position? And what is it like to walk down the street and not be afraid that, I'm going to be targeted by men, or that, Black, people from my community are being targeted by police, right? Like, what do those things feel like? And those are things that I have no idea. And that I think about quite often. And so to me, it's being free to operate without all these things that have been placed on us historically, and just being free to be able to love, and give, in the ways that I think, I believe that we were intended to, in the first place. And so, yeah, being free.
Yeah, that gave me chills just thinking about the self-actualization and freedom. What would it be like to live really freely, to have the things that you need? All right, take us home.
Yeah, it's land back. Land back to me is the answer. It's land back to the people. It's land back is the right of return. Yeah, no. And there are some really good resources that I would like to share with people, just because it's been really influential for me. There's the Red Nation, which also has a podcast, which I've listened to religiously. And Indian Collective is an organization based out of Rapid City who has also done some really cool work around land back and talking about solidarity with Palestine and different movements, which I think is essential for people to learn. And yeah, no, land back also is imagining all of those things. What does it mean to dream outside of colonial boundaries? What how can we retrieve access to all of that magic and all of that history and beauty that was just bombarded in trauma and that was, very intentionally erased? How can we reclaim that, reimagine it, and make it present with us now and always? Because in order to function properly, right, within these systems, it is made, the ask is made of us to leave those things. It is asked of us to very much not believe in magic. And for me, that is what land back is dreaming enough. Yes, dreaming enough, dreaming more, and then also having the actual physical space to manifest those dreams with one another.
That is beautiful. Thank you. That is a word on today. Reimagine, re-envision differently, letting the revolution live. I think that's so powerful for us to reject and question and rethink everything that we've ever known, that we see on a daily basis, right? To be wildly creative in what our future looks like as a collective in solidarity in a space and place where people have what they need on an individual level, and they have what they need not just to sustain and have their basics need met, but to really thrive and live fully into themselves in this world. That is the racially reconciled future that I think we all hope for. So I want to thank you all. Nikki, I know we've probably reached the end of time or overtime, so you'll wrap us up, but thank you all so much for all of the panelists. Thank you for your wisdom, for what you've shared today, for your presence. This was amazing.
Thank you, Katrina, so much. And thank you to all of our panelists as well for being here with us and sharing your insights on this very, very important conversation. And now, just to officially close off Mobilize Women Week, I'd like to welcome Christy Wallace, the CEO of Ellevate Network, to share some closing remarks with us.
Thank you so much for this panel. I think it was the perfect way to end Mobilize Women Week. We have spent this week talking about power dynamics and equity. We've talked about dismantling social constructs. We have talked about building a racially reconciled future and psychological safety and belonging. We've come together in small groups to take these conversations deeper, to bring them into our workplaces, into our lives, into our communities and families. But the work isn't done. It's time to keep mobilizing, to keep moving forward, to keep learning and taking action on behalf of our communities, on behalf of others, to really step up in our workplaces, to create more equality, more equity. We all have the power to do that, each and every one of you. So I say thank you for joining us this week, for making space for these conversations. Thank you so much to all of our speakers who gave so much of themselves to be here and to share their insights and their passions. Thanks to the Ellevate team for making this happen, and to our local chapter and community leaders who have been such a driving force in this community. My ask of all of you is that this doesn't end today, that we keep coming together every day to take these conversations further and to make real and true action and change. Ellevate has a host of different programs and convenings, from local communities to our roundtables to our squads program. So please engage with those, connect with peers, get that type of validation and support the ongoing learning and exposure to diverse perspectives and ideas. The time is now to come together, to mobilize, and to create the world we seek. And I just say thank you to all of you for being a part of that.
Thank you so much, Christy. And thanks again to all of you who have joined in this discussion now and throughout the week. Learning how to advocate for ourselves and our teams and our marginalized individuals in the workplace doesn't have to stop here. This is your moment to take a seat at the table. So again, as a special thank you for joining us at Mobilize Women Week, we are opening up squad applications early just for you all. So Ellevate squads will ensure you set aside 30 minutes each week for you to really dig deep into ideas, different perspectives, and next steps to take to tackle whatever hurdle you're facing. So you can meet with the same 12 people for 12 weeks and really get to know each other. You'll get the accountability that can help you go further. We're going to pop a link in the chat for you to apply now for a squad that meets in September. And again, and one last time, a special thanks to our Mobilize Women Week sponsors, RBC Wealth Management, Accenture, Guardian Life, Verizon, Bunge, BakerHostetler, Diageo, Lincoln Financial Network, Robinson+Cole, Amalgamated Bank, Key for Women, Cornell MBA, Encourage Coaching, National Grid, Lannick, and Mutual of Omaha. We greatly appreciate your support. Again, these conversations matter more now than ever before. There's strength in numbers, and we believe together we can change the world. So thank you for mobilizing with us, and have a great day.